After 3 years of early access fine-tuning, Baldur's Gate 3 is almost here. A sequel 2 decades in the making, Baldur's Gate 3 is being produced by Belgian developer Larian Studios. Like its predecessors, Baldur's Gate 3 is shaping up to be more than just a game, but a deep and detailed dive into the world of Dungeons and Dragons. Not only does it draw from the rich history and lore of Wizards of the Coast's IP, but Baldur's Gate 3 also allows you to live out your fantasy dreams within the Forgotten Realms, as you'll have plenty of tools to create a detailed avatar, define their origin, and recruit companions to your cause. Ahead of its 1.0 launch, here's everything that we know about Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3 is set in the same universe and timeline as previous entries in the series, all of which are based in the Forgotten Realms campaign setting of Dungeons and Dragons. This latest entry takes place 120 years after Baldur's Gate 2, Shadows of Am, and shortly after Descent into Avernus, a tabletop RPG expansion of the series that was released in 2019 to bridge the gap between the previous games and this newest release. Faerun, the continent that serves as the primary setting of the Forgotten Realms, has been invaded by mind flayers, psychic, squid-like creatures that non-D&D players might be aware of thanks to Netflix's Stranger Things, of which an interpretation of the creature has served as one of the show's main antagonists. Much like in the show, mind flayers in Baldur's Gate 3 can infect other beings and turn them into an extension of them. The game opens with the player character having already been captured by these creatures, and in the midst of turning into one of them, when the ship they are being carried on comes under attack and crash lands. The player character teams up with other survivors to not only save the land from the mind flayers, but a way to reverse the process that is slowly transforming them into one. While players can jump into Baldur's Gate 3 without having played prior entries, if you want to know everything that's been going on in the Forgotten Realms up until this point, check out our story recap of Baldur's Gates 1 and 2. Potentially more interesting than the story of the game is the history of its development. The last mainline release of the franchise was in 2001, and soon after, talk of a Baldur's Gate 3 began. Black Isle Studios, one of the creators of the original titles, along with Mass Effect and Dragon Age's developer BioWare, was set to work on the first idea for Baldur's Gate 3, subtitled The Black Hound, for a 2003 release. However, its publisher of the series, Interplay, which was facing hard financial times, closed down the studio and cancelled the game. Interplay then lost the Dungeons & Dragons license in 2008. That license was sought after by several parties, including Brian Fargo, one of Interplay's original founders, who then went on to create In Exile Entertainment, which is now one of Xbox's studios, as well as Obsidian Entertainment, the developers behind games such as Fallout New Vegas and Pillars of Eternity, a spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate. Obsidian is, funnily enough, also now owned by Xbox. Another series that served as a spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate was Divinity. Larian's first entry into their franchise was Divine Divinity in 2002, but after the release of Divinity Original Sin in 2014, the studio began talks with Baldur's Gate and D&D intellectual property owner Wizards of the Coast. However, the latter felt the former was too green in the gaming industry to be trusted with the IP. It was when Larian began development on Original Sin 2, and Wizards was impressed with what they'd seen from marketing materials around the game, that it reached back out to the studio to see if it was still interested in the franchise. As development wrapped on Original Sin 2, ideation on a new Baldur's Gate 3 began at Larian. Baldur's Gate 3 was unveiled in 2019 at a pre-E3 presentation for Google Stadia, which the game was originally meant to release on, although that cloud-based platform now no longer exists. In September of that year, the game was released in early access, covering the first act of the game, and has received incremental updates in the years since. Baldur's Gate 3 can be played solo or multiplayer, either local or online with up to 3 other players. Like its predecessors, the game is an isometric RPG. However, unlike previous entries, this title is turn-based, with its gameplay built upon the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons rule set. As such, a lot of the outcomes of the player's actions will be decided by a dice roll. The main character can be either a pre-built origin character, or one that the player creates from scratch. If the player goes with the latter choice, they'll be able to customize their gender, face, and physical attributes, and throw in some background traits to help better define their build. The most important choices a player will make about their character, however, are their class and their race. Plenty of classes will feature in Baldur's Gate 3, such as Bard, Monk, Barbarian, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. We have a great breakdown on our channel by the developers themselves of each of the classes, but just know that not only will your chosen class affect combat, but the game's story as well. The other element that will affect the game's story is the player's chosen race, of which there are 11 to choose from, with a bunch of sub-races within those 11. They range from human, elf, orc, dwarf, and a myriad of other fantastical options. We also have an in-depth video with the developers breaking down the nuances of each race. As mentioned above, Baldur's Gate 3 can be played with other people, but you can also take CPU companions on your journey as well, each with their own set of stats and skills. And yes, many of these companions can be romanced too. With all these different options, as you can imagine, a big part of the game is about choice, and how those choices affect changes in the game's world and its story. As such, according to Larian, the game will feature a whopping 17,000 potential ending variations. Baldur's Gate 3 will exit early access on PC and see its full release on the platform on August 3rd, 2023 for $60. The game will also come out on PS5 for $70, although at a later date, September 6th, 2023, the same day that Starfield will release on Xbox. Speaking of Xbox, the game as of yet has no release date on the platform. According to Larian, this is due to limitations with the Xbox Series S hardware, namely with local co-op, and the studio wishes to remedy the issue before announcing plans to release the game on current-gen Xbox systems. The game is also coming to the Mac, but as of recording also does not have a release date. If you purchase Baldur's Gate 3 during its early access, you will automatically receive the deluxe edition of the game, although do note, any progress made during this period will not carry over to the 1.0 release. In addition, PS5 players will need to fork over $80 for the deluxe edition on that platform. This version includes several extras, including the digital soundtrack, artbook, and character sheets, as well as additional in-game items. A collector's edition of the game is also releasing for $270, which includes everything in the digital deluxe edition, as well as a bunch of physical goodies, including a Mind Flayer vs. Drow battle statue. However, this version is exclusive to Larian's store, and as of recording is sold out, but those interested can sign up to be notified when it's back in stock. And that's everything to know about Baldur's Gate 3. Check out our interviews with the devs to dive deeper into the game's classes and races, as well as our recap of Baldur's Gates 1 and 2, and keep an eye out for more future coverage, including our review and guide content to help you out in the Forgotten Realms.